guys, welcome back to my channel. I am so excited today because I'm going to do a little bit different of a video for my channel. So if you guys have not seen all over the internet, I don't know where you were, but Kaleidos and Angelica Nyqvist released this palette called Club Nebula, and they did an initial launch and then a restock, and everything in the restock sold out in like 5 seconds, like a literal 5 seconds. So I sat back and I thought about the fact that, you know, probably not everybody who wanted to get this palette actually got it. And I wanted to put together a video of some dupes for you. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, stick with me. We're going to get into it right now. As I said in the intro, this is a dupes video for the Club Nebula palette. Is there a palette out there that has this exact 15 colors in it? Hell no. Are you guys crazy? This is super unique and interesting. But there are plenty of palettes out there that have similar colors in it that if you already have them, you could potentially shop your stash and make an informed decision when they go to do a restock. My understanding from Angelica Nyqvist's video is that they are planning, due to the incredibly high demand from the second restock, they are planning to do a third restock, but they don't know when that's going to happen. They're thinking, I think, springtime, maybe. And so I'm sure there are plenty of people out there that are like, hey, I want to get my hands on this palette, but right now I can't, and I want to dupe the vibes. Or B, I don't know if I necessarily need this palette. I want to see what's really similar. So my goal for this video is not to encourage you to go buy the $25 palettes that I pulled instead. That is obviously not going to be cheaper. That is not what I'm recommending here. What I'm saying is that you may have some of these in your collection already, in which case maybe some of the shades that you're most drawn to in this palette you may already own. Or if you're, you know, wanting to be a little bit more cautious, conservative with your money, you don't have the extra capital to be spending on this palette, because it is pretty expensive. I think by the time I shipped it to my house, it was like $55. So, I mean, it is pretty pricey. So if you don't want to spend that much money, maybe you have some of these palettes already lying around at home, in which case you could say, you know what, I think I'm good with what I have. So that is my goal for you. I will put a couple more disclaimers here. I'm not trying to necessarily dupe the exact shade, although if I did get an exact shade match, I don't think then that I continued looking for additional shades. I just tried to get pretty close or pull a couple different variants. I tried as hard as I could to pull palettes that would still be something that you could access or purchase if it's something that you might be interested in picking up instead of the entire Club Nebula palette. There are a few exceptions here, which are palettes that are also limited edition, but it was the closest thing I had in my collection. And I will say the undertones and things like that for the Club Nebula palette are very interesting, and I think that's part of what makes this palette so special. So not everything has an exact match, but I'm just working with what I have in my collection already. I'm not trying to go purchase additional products to dupe out of this palette, if that makes sense. So is that enough blabbering? Did I blabber enough? Are you guys bored? Okay, so let's go ahead and look at this palette one more time. I think we're going to start with the shimmers, because most of the shimmers I ended up grabbing singles for, because they're kind of like special shades here. The other thing that I did want to mention quick before I start showing individual shades is that the formulas, obviously between all these different brands, are not going to be the same as the Kaleidos formula. I really do enjoy the Kaleidos formula, obviously, or I wouldn't have purchased this palette. So some of the like formulas may not be the exact same, so just something to bear in mind. But the first shade that I wanted to talk about was Firefly, which is this bottom shade down here, and it is a green iridescent shade with a pretty much sheer base, and then it shifts to kind of a warm toned pinky purple. And the closest shade I have is this shade right here, and it is an almost exact dupe. Now this shade is from Divina Sugar Drops, and it is called Sugies. So that's this shade right here. And I think, you know, they both have equally shimmery, light reflecting qualities. I mean, you can see that pretty easily. I think those come pretty close. I do think that the Divina one is just a little bit more like glittery, although there is no glitter in it. I do think it's a little bit more glittery, so that's something to bear in mind. And I think the shift happens at a more narrow angle in the Divina one than in the Kaleidos one. So again, something else to bear in mind. But I do think that these look very, very similar. And if you already have the Sugar Drops collection, or if you already have Sugies out of that collection, you may not necessarily need this shade in the palette if that's the one that you are the most interested in. The next one let's talk about is You're My Only Hope, which is this. So this one is not quite as perfect a match. I mean, they're still pretty close. So this is You're My Only Hope, and this is from Divina, again, Sugar Drops collection, and it's called Taffy Bomb. And so you can see the You're My Only Hope is sort of a soft lilac, and it has kind of that like bluey silver shift. And then this one is kind of that same soft lilac, but it almost pulls a little bit more pink. But when you see it, it looks blue. So I think from your perspective, this looks very similar. They're not the exact same, but I think they're close enough that if you already have this one in your collection, this may be sufficient for you. You may not necessarily need the other product. Do I have to keep saying that? You guys know that that's what we're doing here, right? Like, all right, let's get into the next one, which is Celestial. This one was actually really difficult for me to find. It's kind of a peachy to pink duochrome, and it's just interesting. So here's the one from the Kaleidos Club Nebula Palette. You can see that it pulls like a very cool tone pink fuchsia. And then this is the one that I found. So this doesn't have as much of that like peachy base, but it does definitely still have that kind of like fuchsia look. Although in the camera it looks a little bit more purple, so that's interesting. But that was as close as I could come to that one. Give my arm a break a second. And this shade is Yumlicks, again from the Divina collection, the Sugar Drops collection. So that's their iridescent, like glittery multi-chrome collection that they have. But I thought that those two were fairly close. Are they perfectly matches? No, but I couldn't find anything else that was any more similar. I think Bloodline from Cleona Cosmetics is similar, but this was more of like a sheer iridescent kind of shade, and the Bloodline is more pigmented, so that one I don't think was as useful, so I didn't end up bringing it down here. So just know that that also exists. Alright, the next one to do is Nova, which is this iridescent white with like a purple kind of color to it. And for this one, I took Terra Moon's Zero Gravity. So this is the Kaleidos palette, and then this is Terra Moon. And you can see those are, I mean, the tones are just a little bit different, but it's not so different that it's like unbelievable. You know what I mean? Like, not that you're trying to like copycat this or anything, but I thought those two were pretty similar. So if you were thinking this palette, I only need that one shade, you may want to consider the Terra Moon shade. That single is $17 though, so might want to get it out on sale, I don't know. But there are discount codes and stuff that you can use. So I thought those two looked really similar. In the lighting here, as I look at them, you can see like this one looks just a little bit warmer, this one looks a little bit cooler. So they're not, again, not exactly the same, but I feel like they're so close that if you're trying to get a look that pulls in a shade like that, by the time you get it on your eyes, I'm not sure they're going to be different enough to warrant purchasing an entire palette for one shade. So, alright, and then the last, oh no, that's not the last shimmer. The next shimmer we're going to talk about is Nebula. And this one, it looks very like peachy in the pan. And it comes across almost as like a sheer base with like an orangey red reflect. So I pulled out Terra Moon's Red Giant. And you can see these are not exactly the same, but a red like shimmer like this is really difficult to come by. This I think is one of the more unique shades in the palette. So for me, I thought these were close. If you're putting this Red Giant over top of another, let me see, can I get the flash? There you go. If you're putting that over top of another eyeshadow, like a red eyeshadow or orange or anything like that, I think you're going to get the same effect that you're looking for, but they're not an exact match. Okay, and then just one more shimmer in the palette, and then we can move on to the mattes. I think the mattes were actually even more challenging to find dupes for than the shimmers, because the mattes have such interesting undertones. Like, compared to mattes that I have throughout the rest of my collection, I think I spent like 3 hours swatching eyeshadows just to see if I could find mattes that fit with this. So the only blue that I have that is similar to the blue in the Kaleidos palette is actually from another Kaleidos palette, and it is the Astro Pink, like this blue right here. And I'm sure it's because they're probably using a similar pigment, but I think for the Astro Pink palette they put it into like a gray, like a dark gray or black base, and I think for Angie's palette they did like a light base or a sheer base. It's kind of hard to tell. But this is the Kaleidos Club Nebula palette, and then this one is the Astro Pink palette, which is Futurism 3. So you can see the actual like reflect of the kind of aqua shade is the same, but the bases are different. This one definitely has a lighter base, this one definitely has a deeper base. But again, by the time you get that on the eyes, are you going to necessarily see much of a difference? Kind of hard to say. So if you already have this one and really you were just vibing for that, you know, kind of astro blue shade, maybe you already have enough in your collection. It's up to you. Alright, let me wipe these swatches off and then we're going to get into the matte. Hey guys, so I did also zoom us out a little bit in case things look a little bit different. I'm just thinking that'll give me a little bit more like swatch real estate, because otherwise I'm like leaning right off the screen. We'll see if I get my act together here. So now I'm ready to go in and talk about some of these mattes, and what I'm going to do is kind of go across the top with these 4 mattes, then hit these 3 mattes, then we'll hit these 2 on the bottom. And I think in that way you'll at least be able to see kind of a more cohesive color story, because the shades are definitely interesting, but they're definitely like grouped by family. So that's a long drawn out unnecessary thing to say. So the first one to talk about is the shade 7 of 9. So let me go ahead and swatch that one first. So that one looks like this, and it is a really pretty like aqua blue. It's a matte, it's very, very soft and buttery. I really think this shade is very, very nice. So this is the original shade. There are 2 palettes that I have in my collection that I think kind of mimic that shade. The first is from Lunar Beauty's Moonspell palette. Again, this is a limited edition palette, but if you already have it in your collection, it might work for you. And the shade that I'm looking at is the shade Nancy. And I think it's a little bit deeper, but I think you could sheer it out, and by the time you blend it out onto the lid, you may not necessarily see that much difference. You may be fine with that level of closeness, if you will. The other one that I thought of was in the Glam Like Cake palette, so I'm going to pop that out of its little home. And it is the shade Icy Mint here, which looks like this. This one I think is a little bit more vibrant of a blue, but it's very close in tone. So if you were looking for kind of that like tonal similarity, that's the one that I would go for. If you want something a little bit more subdued, because this is definitely brighter than this. This is definitely like grungier. So it depends on, do you want it to go a little bit more grungy or do you want it to go a little bit brighter? But either way, those 2 things I think are very, very close in tone and color to this shade that we have, 7 of 9 from the Kaleidos palette. So that's the blues. Let's move on to the green. So the green was actually really tricky. This is the green called Gravity. And I didn't think it was going to be as hard as it was, but I found a lot of different things that kind of were similar enough to this that I thought they were worth talking about. So this is the shade from the original palette. This is called Gravity. The first one I'm going to go back into is the Glam Like Cake palette, And I'm going to pull the shade Key Lime, which is obviously the green at the bottom. And you can see this one's a little bit brighter, although it's coming through muted because I swatched the blues first and my hands are filling up with pigment. There you go. That's a better representation of the color. So you can see it's a little bit more like grassy green rather than kind of a lime chartreuse green. Which, by the way, have you guys heard how Angie says chartreuse? It sounds so pretty. Okay, the next one that could potentially work would be from Ace Beauté Oceanic palette, and it's the shade Algae, which is this bottom shade right here. This one definitely does pull a little bit like brighter and warmer, I think, but if you already have it, you're looking to dupe the vibe, not necessarily the exact shade, that one might work for you. We also have from Profusion Cosmetics, they have the Emeralds palette, and if you look at this fern shade right here, this does also have a very similar color. It's a little bit deeper, grungier, but again, if these were too bright for you, then this Profusion one may work better for you. The Profusion palettes are $5, so if that's really the shade that you're going for, that's the one to pick out. Okay, I have two more colors to show you that are in this same green family. The first comes from the Exotic Peacock palette by Pinky Rose, and it is this shade Risque right here. This is again going to be a little bit more like mustardy green, very, I would say closer probably than some of these to this, but because this color is so unique, it's hard to find like a perfect undertone match to another palette. But again, if you're looking at it saying, I already have this thing in my collection, do I need this other thing? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. If it's something where you're saying like, I want that shade, but I think I want it like a little bit brighter or a little bit darker, a little bit grungier, maybe you already have that in your collection. So this is all meant to be fun. I hope you guys are enjoying this because this is a pain in the butt video to film. But there we go. And then there's one more I wanted to show you for the green, which was the Sugar Pill Pink capsule, the little green guy right here, which you can already see through the window. Looks like that. Very, very similar. Probably the closest in similarity to the original shade there. But those were all the kind of chartreusey, limey greens that I had in my collection that I thought at least got into the ballpark of the one from Club Nebula. So the next one to talk about then is Queen of Blades. Queen of Blades is kind of like a denim, smoky denim blue. And it is also a matte. Now when I looked at this one, I thought of one palette and one palette only. And that is the At Forest Sight palette by Raw Beauty Kristi in Colourpop. And believe it or not, I was thinking the Emerald City shade would be a little bit closer, but actually the Pacific Northwest PNW shade is so similar. This is the Kaleidos, and then there's Colourpop's. It's perfect. Like it's perfect. This one has maybe the touch warmer than this one. I think you could make the case for that, but you would be very hard pressed to distinguish these two on the eyes. Alright, and then the last one in the top row is called Void, and it is that nice dark navy blue. Kaleidos shades are so soft and buttery. I really enjoy swatching them. And the closest that I came, get that out of the way. The closest that I came was actually in a Nomad Cosmetics palette, this Lago de Como. And it is the shade Mozzafiato, this one down here. And these are not exactly the same. I'll grant you they're not as good of a dupe for each other, but I do still think they're both really beautiful, dark, dark navy blues, and I think that they would be easy to work with. And so that's our navy blues. The top one is the Kaleidos palette, and then this bottom one is the Nomad palette. Sorry, I'm like flicking you guys off. This is not looking so good for my fingers, you guys. Oh goodness, but this is fun. I think this is so interesting. I hope you guys are really enjoying this, because I think it's kind of interesting to like dupe out the vibes of a palette. So you guys will have to let me know what you think. All right, the next one is Nuur, and so now we're getting into the second row here. This is Nuur, and this color was so challenging to find in my collection because of the undertone and because of how light the shade is. It's a very soft taupey gray color. It's cool toned. It reminds me almost of like a pantyhose color. That's really what it reminds me of. And so I was like scouring my collection looking for something that would work with that. Now the thing is, I don't wear tons of neutrals, obviously, so for me, that was the additional challenge, is that I don't have tons of neutral palettes to like scour to find something that works for this shade. So the one that I think came the closest was actually from an old Lorac Pro palette. This is the Pro 2, and it's this shade here called Cool Gray. So let me pick that up, and then let me swatch the original color too, because that will be helpful for you. The one in the pan actually looks a little bit more brown toned, but when you get it like on your skin, you see it's more like gray. Actually, these look really nice together. Holy smokes. I guess that's why Angie put them in the same palette, huh? So this is the Lorac palette, Cool Toned Gray, and you can see it's a little deeper, so I think if you sheared it out, you'd kind of get the same vibe. Lorac, you know, their palettes are a little older, they're not necessarily as in vogue, so they might be a little bit cheaper. If that's a shade you were really interested in, that might work for you. You may already even have that in your collection if you haven't decluttered it. The other shade that I think spoke to my mind was the That's Taupe palette, this shade called Python. This one does pull a little bit more brown, I think, than the original, or like a reddish kind of undertone than the original. But I do think that it's worth noting that those are pretty similar. So that again might be something you already have in your collection. Too Faced Natural Lust palette. I can't get through a video without talking about Too Faced, right? This shade called Embrace Me. I really thought there was going to be a lot of options in this palette to kind of dupe out that vibe, but this is much too dark for what I'm looking for, and these other shades are much too light. So really Embrace Me was the only option I had here, and it's a nice shade, but again, I think it's a little bit more brown toned, as this one is a little bit more gray toned. So you can see there is a difference. Oh my gosh, those would be like great nude lipstick colors. That's pretty. Anyway, so this one, I think the thing that you'll come to understand very quickly about this video is the fact that the undertones of these particular shades are what make the shades so special. So even though there are similar products in other palettes throughout at least my collection, the undertone is what makes it special. The last one for that shade comes from Revolution Night and Day palette, and it is this shade up here called Pavement, or Pavement, I don't know, it doesn't matter, Paved. And it looks like this. So it's a little bit lighter than the other choices, so if you're looking for something that's like the super light side of things, this would be your choice. But I think you could build it up. It is still not quite the same undertone as the original shade though, so that's just something to know. Okay, and we already did Astro, so let's hop over to the shade Rock Copper. And this one gave me a hard time too. Again, these undertones are what's so like challenging and special about these shades. And my goodness, are these shades so soft. This is like a stony gray kind of a shade. Do I have enough space? Yeah, we'll make it work. All right, you guys, you're gonna have to look at my elbow, sorry. So this is Rock Copper, and it's this like smoky amethyst gray kind of shade. Very, very pretty. And I did find a couple of things in my collection that I thought would work for that. The one that comes the closest is the most frustrating because I'm not sure exactly what this is. I think this is an ABH single, but I could not honestly tell you the name. But that looks like this. It almost has to be an ABH single because I don't think I have any other unnamed singles in my collection. So that was one. And if you really need the shade name, let me know. I'll try to see if I can find it. But for entertainment's sake, you probably don't need the shade name. I'm so sorry. I misswatched a color here, so I did have to erase it. And I erased a little bit of this shade too. So I'm so sorry about that. But we are on the shade Rock Copper. And we've done the single. So now we need to talk about Colourpop Blowing Smoke. And this is the shade Ignite, which is this one right here. This one is like a silvery shade. Do you guys have some of these palettes where like they always are trying to pop out? Like, is that just my palettes? Because that's so annoying. But anyway, this is the shade Ignite from the Colourpop Blowing Smoke palette. You can see it definitely is more gray toned, but it's very similar. So this one does have a little bit of shimmer in it, but you're never going to see it on the lid. It's way too small of a shimmer, so that would be an option from Blowing Smoke if you already have that one in your collection. Would be one to consider. Next one would come from the Profusion Smoky palette. This is the shade Graphite, and again, I think this is a little bit more like gray toned, but it does exist as an option. So you can see, you know, all of the tones, the undertones are what make these so challenging to dupe out. And I think that that's what makes the Club Nebula palette so special. But again, if it's not $55 special to you, maybe you would get away with some of these other options. Last one to show you for that is Nomad's Tokyo Harajuku palette. And I thought this kind of gray shade over here, Visual K, I'm not quite sure. This one is definitely more like grungy gray rather than like a violet gray, but I do think that it looks really pretty. This whole arm looks really nice together, like, oof, yeah. But I think, you know, the undertone for this being just ever so soft purple leaning is what makes it so special. The closest one I would say is probably the Colourpop Blow and Smoke choice, but these other three are solid options if you already have them in your collection. Okay, you guys, I think we have 3 more shades to go, and that's great because I think this rotator cuff is about to pop right off. I used to play tennis in high school and a little bit in college, but mostly in high school, and my shoulders have never been the same. So the next one that we are moving into is this plummy beauty right here, and this is called Cylon. It looks like this. It's a little, I can't even describe it as like neutral. I mean, it's a little warm leaning of like a grapey purple. That's what I would describe this as. And I had 3 options for you for this one. The first is this Colourpop single in Sleeper. This is the one that I accidentally swatched earlier, and then I was like, oh girl, these are not the same shade. What are you doing? So this one, really pretty, really pigmented, a bit warmer though. So that would be kind of the trade-off. And this is just a Z palette, but it's this single right here. The next one was from She's in Parties, another favorite of Angelica Nyqvist. Why do I have false lashes stuck to my She's in Parties palette? This shade right here called Mean Streak. So you can see a little bit deeper, a little bit grungier, but still very pretty. And then the last one that I thought came close was in the Zodiac palette, and this one I think pulls a little bit more kind of purple back to where we were. So I'll actually swatch 2 out of here. I'm going to swatch these 2 right here. So there's the first one, and there's the second one. And that second one might actually be a little bit closer to the original. But you can see you've got a couple different choices there from some palettes. And if you're looking for something to just kind of smoke out the outer V, throw into the crease, you may not necessarily see that like all over the lid. You may be a little bit freer to play with the toning of that shade a little bit more. you guys. My poor fingers. All right. So that is those purple shades similar to Cylon, which is there at the top. Now the next one to move into is Seamus. Seamus? I don't know. It's this kind of peachy color right here. And I will swatch it right here. So this is like a really nice bright kind of peachy color, and I immediately thought of the Miss Bliss palette from Colourpop. So if you have any of these pastel palettes like Glam Light Ice Cream Dream palette, or the BH Lost in LA, I don't know if they have an orange in that palette. I don't remember, but if you have that one, you may have some like pastel shades. If you have Creepy Cute palette from Shroud, I mean, there's a lot of different pastel palettes out there, so I think, you know, those would be your best bets to find a similar shade. The shade that I was going for is the shade Optimist, which I'm going to swatch with the same finger so that I don't get all this black cluttering up the color here. But these were so similar when I swatched them. I was like, look no further. That's as close as I'm going to get. So that was what I thought came very close for that shade. And now we're on to the last shade. This is so exciting. Okay, so the last shade is Red Giant, and I think it's my favorite only because it has that little like club pressed into it, the little like Ace of Clubs kind of club. So let me swatch that out for you. And this is like a really nice, like vibrant bricky red. That's kind of what this color is vibing. So I found a couple things that I thought came close to that. The first is from Colourpop X's and O's, and it's the shade Reckless, although I think even Realness might be a good option too. But let's do Reckless here. Little deeper in tone, but very similar in shade. So that's one option. The next one came from the Urban Decay Naked Cherry palette, and this was the shade Devilish, which is right here. This one is a little bit lighter in tone, a little bit more like browny maroon as opposed to like bright red, but I still think that it's very pretty, very similar. You may have that in your collection already. Naked Cherry's been around for a while. And the last one that's similar would be from BH Cherry on Top palette. I don't know if this one is still for sale or not. I think it's one of the ones that kind of lingered for a little bit though, so it may still be, and it would be this shade called Sprinkles. And you can see it's a little bit more bright and vibrant compared to the red, but again, if you're using this to deepen out a crease, deepen, you know, V, whatever, I think you would still get enough similarity for that particular part of the palette. And now that I've basically shown you an entire moving box full of eyeshadow palettes, you're going to have to let me know, did you guys pick this palette up? Are you going to pick this palette up? Are there certain shades that caught your eye in this palette and maybe the rest of the palette is not something you're interested in which case maybe this video is going to be really helpful for you. Let me know if you found this video helpful or interesting or entertaining or anything. My poor arm is in need of some moisturizer, so I am about to go get some because that is way too much micellar water for my arm. But I will say that of the several times that I've used this palette already, I really do enjoy the palette. I think that if you are interested in picking it up and you really enjoy the color story, or you think you're going to enjoy this color story, you're not going to be disappointed by the quality. I think Angelica and Kaleidos did a really good job putting together an interesting and unique color story. And while there are shades in other palettes that are very similar, I don't think you can dupe this palette out anywhere perfectly. But if you're maybe not thinking you want to pick this up right now, or it's out of stock and it's driving you absolutely batty that you can't play with these shades right now, maybe this video will give you some inspiration to dig through your own collection, find some shades that are pretty similar, and kind of dupe out that vibe while you're waiting for the next restock. Okay, and with that said, I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'm going to catch you in my next video. Bye!